What's up? Jeff Morris here, Think International. We're at Sticky Teams Conference 3 2012. What winning looks like. I'm here with Shawn Lovejoy, pastor of Mountain Lake Church, as well as directional leader of churchplanners.com. How you doing?
Great, man. How are you, Jeff?
Super good, super good. Now you oversee, your church has actually planted how many churches?
We planted about 5 churches in the last 4 years, but the biggest part of what we do is resourcing and coaching church planners who are already out there on the field. Right. And coaching pastors who are trying to get this thing done called kingdom work.
Exactly. Now church planning is a major deal right now. How does one know if it's time to plant a church, or how does a church know it's time to plant a church?
Well, I think we don't have to pray about whether we should start churches. I mean, it's part of the Great Commission to multiply, to reproduce ourselves, reproduce kingdom work, reproduce, ecclesia communities, and that's all about church planting. So if you want my bias, we should always be planting church, and the church needs more and more leaders who will be willing to go out and plant new seeds of the gospel in new communities.
There's always a cost to everything we do, and especially with planning a church. Now, different people, different philosophies, I guess, dictate how they do so, but what is in general a cost financially, resource-wise, to a church in order to plant another church?
Well, believe it or not, there's not as much financial cost attached to it as what many churches think. With the move in church planting and the growth and even the vibrancy that we've seen happen in the church growth movement with church planting. There's so many networks, so many denominations, so many large churches now that have church planting networks. All we need to do is be willing to be a piece of the pie. Exactly. And the last 5 churches we've planted these last 4 years out of our church, we were just one of the resource pieces. So many churches think they've got to be the sole resource piece for that church. But actually, there's more kingdom inter-networking happening among networks, churches, and denominations than ever before. And we're doing this together. The Great Recession's even helped us with that.
Really?
We have to rely on each other. And more and more we're seeing that to be the case.
Are there certain pockets of, just to say the United States, certain pockets that are better church planting pockets right now than others?
I wouldn't say that there are. I mean, there are certain areas that are always more difficult, obviously. But in even those areas, we're seeing churches bloom and blossom and have kingdom successful work. So it's not easy anywhere.
No.
Some people think that planting a church is easier than pastoring a traditional church. It's difficult. It's just as difficult as anything else. But with the tools and the resources and the coaching, where we've been able to come along as a ministry is helping these guys after they get out there on the field and they're dealing with these leadership issues they've never dealt with before as senior pastors and church planners. Put our hands on their shoulder, tell them we believe in them, and they can do this with Christ's power.
What are, so you said difficulties and of course coaching, leadership and stuff. What are some of the difficulties right now that are really, that a lot of these pastors are facing?
I think having a healthy scorecard is so important. In my book, The Measure of Our Success, I talk about making sure the scoreboard reflects Christ's heart. That our efforts and our ministry efforts is not designed and built upon a motivation to be famous. Which is one of the addicting drugs in ministries these days.
For sure.
And our prayer needs to be that God would develop us and develop people, not necessarily He'd discover us and discover our church and make us famous. So I think having a healthy scorecard from day one, how are we going to measure success? What is it going to look like for us to be an effective light in this community? What is our process, for that? Versus just, we're going to put up video screens and we're going to serve coffee and we're going to be run over with people.
Exactly.
And I tell pastors all the time, that is so 1999.
Right.
And it's not going to be effective. So what are we going to do? What is our distinctiveness going to be in this community? And how am I going to measure, our ministry effectiveness? By the world's standards, or uniquely, what God's called us to be and do.
What are, how important is it to have systems in place, even when you have a staff of 3, systems in order to grow?
I get asked all the time, Shawn, we've been meeting about 6 months. When should we start small groups? And I always say about 6 months ago. About 6 months ago. All of this needs to be in place. If your goal is not just to have a service, but to make disciples and connect people with Christ and His body and His mission, those are things we need to work on the front side. And then we need to be, working and making those systems healthy every day and every week. It's not just about the weekend. There's so much more involved in making disciples. So those are the things we give our lives to, week in and week out.
That's great. Now, resources out there, like you said, you wrote a book, websites that you know of that church planners, pastors, leaders could just check out.
Yeah, churchplanners.com. You can follow us there at Church Planners on Twitter. Also, we do a church planning conference every year in Atlanta called Velocity. We have about 1,000 pastors, ministry leaders from all over America. And I wrote a book this year for pastors that kind of helps us discover the scorecard according to Christ's heart, the measure of our success, and Impassioned Plea to pastors, to kind of give pastors to be uniquely who God's called them to be and do in their ministry context. Hopefully it's an encouraging word.
That's awesome. Hey, Shawn, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Appreciate you guys.
Think International, sticky teams.